December 18th, 1944, before sunrise in the Ardennes forest. An American infantryman crouches in a frozen foxhole near Bastogne-Breth, turning to white vapor fingers, numb not from cold, but from fear. The ground trembles before. The sound arrives, a low, mechanical growl, steel tracks biting into frozen earth. Something is coming through the fog, something heavy, something that for 4 years has meant only one thing for men. Like him, run, hide, die, sometimes in that order. He is 23 years old, exhausted, hungry, and carrying a weapon that barely existed when the war began. Resting across his shoulder is a tube. Most soldiers still do not trust, loaded with a new kind of ammunition, wrapped in secrecy promised by engineers and doubted by veterans. Through gaps in the fog he sees it. The angular roof of a German tank, then another, the lead commander stands, exposed, scanning the tree line, unaware that the rules of this war are about to change. Infantryman knows he has seconds before the turret turns fully, before the main gun fires, before everything ends. The document in his pack says, "The rocket can burn through armor thicker than the steel rolling toward him." But paper has lied before. Banned. Tanks do not forgive mistakes. This moment in the frozen woods is not about heroism or glory. It is about a simple, brutal question. Can a man on foot finally kill the machine designed to crush him? Or will this new weapon fail like so many promises before? What happens in the next few seconds will not just decide who lives in this foxhole. It will quietly rewrite how modern war is fought forever. By late 1944, American infantry across Europe shared a private fear they rarely spoke about because admitting it felt like weakness. The fear was not artillery or machine guns or even snipers. It was tanks. The sound came first, a deep, mechanical vibration that traveled through frozen ground and into bones before the engine noise reached the ears. When German armor appeared, infantrymen instinctively searched for cover because what they carried could kill men, but not steel. The M1 Garand was deadly against flesh. The bar could pin down positions, grenades could clear rooms, but none of it mattered when armored vehicles rolled forward behind sloped plates and rotating turrets. Infantry doctrine said tanks were someone else's problem, artillery, air support, or friendly armor. But in reality, especially during the Ardennes offensive, tanks appeared suddenly through forests, fog, villages, and narrow roads, where American armor could not respond fast enough. German commanders understood this imbalance and exploited it, sending panzer units deep into infantry, held territory, counting on fear and paralysis to open corridors. Through American lines, soldiers learned the term panzer paralysis, the moment when a unit froze, because nothing they had could stop what was coming, and freezing usually got men killed. Reports from Italy, France, and Belgium repeated the same pattern. Infantry, encountering enemy armor without immediate support, suffered catastrophic losses, not because they fought poorly, but because they had no tools that worked. The bazooka existed, but confidence in it did not. The early rockets required near-perfect conditions. Flat armor, short range, no obstructions, and calm nerves. In combat, none of those conditions existed. Tanks moved, angled their hulls, fired back, and carried infantry screens whose sole purpose was to kill bazooka teams before they could close the distance. Veterans joked darkly that the bazooka was useful mainly for giving soldiers hope while they died anyway. German crews learned quickly to respect artillery and air power, but infantry with tube weapons were dismissed unless dangerously closed. This imbalance shaped the battlefield in subtle ways. Infantry avoided roads, bridges, and open terrain, even when tactically necessary patrols withdrew. Prematurely, when armor was suspected, positions were abandoned simply because the psychological weight of tanks outweighed the mission. Command knew the problem existed. Engineers knew the solution existed, but between theory and a working battlefield, weapon lay years of failed designs. Physics challenges and production realities shaped charge. Theory was not new. Scientists understood that a hollow cone backed by explosive could focus energy into a jet capable of penetrating armor. Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union fielded such weapons with varying success, but American attempts to integrate the concept into a reliable infantry system repeatedly stumbled. Stability, fusing, standoff, distance, and manufacturing precision proved difficult to solve simultaneously, especially under wartime pressure. Early American-shaped charge experiments either failed to detonate properly or produced inconsistent penetration that made them unreliable in combat. Something that works only sometimes is worse than something that never works, because it gets men killed through false confidence. Meanwhile, German armor continued to improve. Frontal plates thickened, slopes increased, and crews adapted tactics to minimize exposure. The Ardennes offensive magnified everything: dense forests, limited air support, snow-grounded aircraft, roads, funneled movement, and visibility collapsed into fog and shadow. Ideal conditions for tanks, and a nightmare for infantry, yet quietly away from the front lines. American engineers were solving problems not with heroics, but with math, metallurgy, and relentless testing. The question was not whether a shaped charge could penetrate armor. The question was whether it could do so predictably from a weapon carried by exhausted, frightened 20-year-olds in freezing conditions under fire. The answer was arriving not with fanfare but in crates, marked with red bands, shipped forward under secrecy to eunuchs that had no idea how much the balance of power was about to shift. Part 1 of this story is about helplessness, about the long years when infantry could only endure, about why the appearance of a small red-banded rocket in late 1944 mattered so much, because before it arrived, American soldiers faced tanks with courage, tactics, and prayers, and that was never enough. The solution to the tank problem did not arrive with a sudden breakthrough, but through slow, painful iteration, driven by rising casualty lists and quiet desperation inside. American ordnance offices shaped charge theory had existed for decades, but turning theory into a weapon that an infantryman could fire from a shoulder tube in snow, mud, darkness, and panic required more. than equations. It required solving multiple failures at once. Early American experiments showed promise on test plates, yet failed in the field because physics did not care about intent. Shaped charges demanded precision. The copper liner angle had to be exact, the explosive had to detonate symmetrically, and the warhead had to strike armor at the right distance for the jet to form correctly, to close. And the liner collapsed without focus too far, and the jet dispersed, losing energy. The bazooka complicated everything. Its rocket spun in flight to stabilize itself, a necessity for accuracy, but rotation threatened. To tear a forming jet apart, engineers had to balance spin rate, warhead, weight, and liner geometry without modern simulation tools, meaning each adjustment required live testing at proving grounds where failure meant wasted time and sometimes injured testers. Reports from Aberdeen showed dozens of variants rejected, not because they did not work once, but because they did not work every time. Reliability mattered more than peak performance, because infantry lives would depend on consistency, not best-case scenarios. By mid-1944, the pressure intensified. German armor was thicker, better sloped, and more numerous than earlier in the war, while Allied infantry increasingly operated without immediate tank support, particularly in forests, towns, and mountains. The engineers' response was ruthless simplification. Keep the rocket, the soldiers already knew. Keep the launcher. Keep training. Minimal but radically improve what happened on impact. The warhead that emerged from this process incorporated a carefully machined copper liner, shaped not for maximum penetration alone, but for jet stability. Across imperfect impact angles and variable conditions, the explosive fill combined materials to achieve faster detonation velocity, ensuring liner collapse occurred evenly. The most critical innovation was the standoff mechanism, a fragile-looking nose extension, designed to collapse on contact and halt the warhead at a precise distance from the armor. This ensured that even if the rocket struck at slightly imperfect angles, the jet would still form with lethal coherence. Tests against captured German armor showed results that surprised even skeptical officers. Penetration increased significantly, not always enough to defeat the heaviest frontal plates, but sufficient against sides, turrets, rear decks, and weak points that infantry could realistically target under combat conditions. The weapon was never magic, and engineers knew that, which is why manuals stressed angle, range, and shot placement. Yet, compared to earlier rockets, the improvement was decisive. Demonstrations held in Britain late in 1944 replaced disbelief with quiet respect. Observers noted that the effect was not dramatic, no massive explosion, no fireball, just a brief flash followed by catastrophic internal damage. The small entry holes masked the violence inside sandbags. Shredded steel spool embedded everywhere, scorch marks lining the interior like shadows frozen in place. Production moved forward under secrecy. Shipments were prioritized for units expected to face armor in confined terrain and cold weather conditions. The ammunition arrived with warnings about fragility, temperature, sensitivity, and handling instructions. That made infantry grumble, but also made them curious. Soldiers tend to trust weapons that demand respect. Rumors spread faster than official briefings. A bazooka round that actually worked, one that could kill tanks without suicidal range, closed the psychological gap that had haunted infantry since 1940. Before the first shot was fired in anger, the weapon had already altered behavior. Men trained harder, practiced ambushes, cleared firing lanes, and studied enemy armor profiles. Because, for the first time, effort felt worthwhile. This part of the story is not about battlefield heroics, but about engineers solving a problem others said could not be solved, and about a weapon that mattered not because it was perfect, but because it was reliable enough to give infantry something they had lacked for years: a real chance. The first time the new rockets were carried into the line, they did not arrive with speeches or ceremony. They arrived quietly, mixed into standard ammunition loads, handed out by tired supply sergeants who barely understood what made them different. Infantrymen noticed the red bands first, then the warnings about handling, then the unusual emphasis during briefings on shot placement, angle, and patience. The men who had survived tank encounters before were skeptical. Experience had taught them that confidence and reality rarely matched, yet the conditions of the Ardennes left no room for waiting. German armor pushed through forest roads, villages, and frozen clearings, where infantry positions became sudden front lines. December 18, 1944. Dawn came late, under heavy fog, near Bastogne. Visibility collapsed into shifting gray walls, and sound replaced sight. The approach of tanks announced itself through vibration before Shape Sergeant Jim Morrison and his bazooka team lay hidden in a foxhole carved into frozen earth, exhausted beyond normal limits. Hunger, cold, and fear blending into a dull focus. When the first panzer shape emerged, it did not look dramatic. It looked inevitable. Bazooka rounds before, and watched them fail, or bounce, or detonate. Uselessly he expected the same, but there was no alternative. The turret began to rotate toward friendly positions, and time compressed into seconds. The decision to fire was not heroic. It was automatic. The rocket left the tube with familiar recoil, yet the impact was different. A brief, sharp flash, no explosion, no noise louder than expected, then silence, followed by sudden chaos as hatches burst open, smoke poured out, and a crewman emerged. Burning the kiln was not cinematic. It was abrupt, unsettling, final. The second tank reacted too late, reversing clumsily through fog before suffering the same fate. From a second shot that struck at an imperfect angle yet still disabled the veer completely, the third tank withdrew immediately, leaving behind wrecks and confusion. What mattered most was not the destruction itself, but the reaction afterward. American infantry who witnessed the engagement felt something shift internally. Tanks were no longer gods of the battlefield. They were threats, yes, but threats that could be hunted. German crews sensed it to reports, intercepted later, revealed confusion, alarm, and sudden caution. Commanders ordered increased spacing infantry, screens, and longer engagement ranges, but the psychological damage was already done. Word spread faster than orders. Within hours, other bazooka teams tested the weapon in combat with similar results. Not every shot killed, Not every engagement succeeded, but enough to erase the old paralysis. Infantry began choosing ambush sites, deliberately clearing brush, aligning foxholes with likely tank approaches, coordinating multiple teams for overlapping fire rather than hoping armor would bypass them. By afternoon, burning wrecks dotted roads that had been considered impassable for infantry. Only days earlier, officers struggled to restrain overconfidence, reminding men that the weapon still demanded discipline and that mistakes were fatal. But morale surged in a way no speech could have achieved. This part of the story marks the turning point, not because technology suddenly won the war, but because it restored agency to soldiers who had been forced to endure rather than fight the bazooka. With effective shaped charge, ammunition did not make infantry invincible, it made them dangerous, and that difference reshaped every engagement that followed. As the fighting continued through the Ardennes, the initial shock of effective infantry anti-tank fire settled into a brutal routine. Learning curve success demanded discipline, because the weapon that gave infantry a chance could also betray them. If misunderstood, units that rushed to use it without preparation paid in blood. The shaped charge demanded respect. The standoff nose was fragile, easily bent by careless handling. A dent, invisible in poor light, could ruin penetration. Entirely cold, whether thickened lubricants, reduced explosive sensitivity, and numbed fingers that needed to perform precise movements under stress. Men learned to cradle rockets like glass, storing them inside coats, sleeping bags, and improvised shelters to keep temperatures stable. They learned to inspect each round daily, running gloved fingers along the nose cone, checking for deformation, corrosion, or loose. Fusing teams cleared firing lanes, meticulously cutting branches, stamping down snow and debris, because even a twig could trigger premature detonation and waste a shot. Experienced gunners waited for angle rather than range, letting tanks pass to expose side armor or rear decks. Despite the instinct to fire as soon as a target appeared, patience separated kills from Mrs. German crews. Adapted as well, they increased infantry screens, sent grenadiers forward to flush out ambushes, and covered likely bazooka positions with machine gun fire before advancing tanks acquired spare track links, welded road wheels, and improvised spaced armor to whole sides, hoping to disrupt jets. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. When jets struck through added layers without losing cohesion, confidence among infantry grew further. The battlefield became a contest of adaptation rather than inevitability. German tactics emphasized distance and suppression, while American infantry emphasized concealment, coordination, and timing. Night and fog became allies rather than enemies. Close terrain, once avoided, became hunting grounds. Villages, forests, hedgerows, all favored men willing to wait, still and silent, while armor rolled past, then strike. Where steel was weakest, reports from company commanders noted a shift in behavior. Squads no longer abandoned positions at the first rumor of tanks. Instead, they reorganized, repositioned bazooka teams, and prepared ambushes. Casualties still occurred, but they felt purposeful rather than helpless. Training spread informally. Veterans taught newcomers where to aim, how to judge angle, how to read engine sounds to estimate speed and distance. Bazooka teams developed hand signals, silent communication, and rehearsed reloads under fire. The psychological weight that tanks once carried diminished. They were still dangerous, but no longer untouchable. This shift forced German armor to slow, advances burning fuel and time they could not spare during an offensive that relied on speed delays. Cascaded resupply, faltered coordination broke down, and opportunities closed. The shaped charge rocket did not stop the Ardennes offensive alone, but it contributed to friction that compounded across days and weeks. Every disabled tank blocked roads, forced rerouting, and consumed recovery assets. German commanders began treating infantry held terrain with caution that bordered on paranoia, assuming every shadow hid a bazooka. This caution saved American lives in ways impossible to quantify. By mid-January, reports described infantry deliberately luring armor into kill zones, sacrificing ground temporarily to gain position for decisive shots. Officers struggled to balance aggression with restraint, reminding men that the weapon had limits, that frontal armor, at bad angles, still resisted penetration, and that overconfidence invited disaster. This phase of the story is about adaptation on both sides. A quiet arms race fought at ranges measured in yards and seconds, where discipline mattered more than bravery, and where the difference between survival and death lay in whether a copper cone collapsed perfectly or not. As winter dragged into the new year, the weapon that restored infantry confidence revealed its hidden costs, because power came with complexity, and complexity punished mistakes. Some bazooka teams learned the limits too late. Rockets struck at shallow angles and failed to penetrate, detonating harmlessly or disabling tanks without killing them. Crews who fired too early gave away their positions and died under machine gun fire or artillery retaliation. Others learned that vegetation fences or rubble could sabotage a shot by triggering the fuse at the wrong distance, turning a lethal weapon into dead weight where they proved an unforgiving enemy. Extreme cold reduced explosive sensitivity, leading to occasional failures to detonate, while repeated freezing and thawing caused corrosion on copper liners that disrupted jet formation. Humidity crept into storage crates and ruined rounds. Silently, soldiers adapted by sleeping with rockets, storing them near bodies, insulating crates with blankets, and scavenged material, treating ammunition like living things that needed care. German countermeasures evolved. Rapidly spaced armor appeared in the form of mesh screens, metal skirts, and improvised barriers, designed to trigger detonation. Early, sometimes they worked, sometimes the jet punched through anyway, but uncertainty alone forced infantry to adjust aim points. Again, turret faces, rear engine decks, hull sides between road wheels where angles approached perpendicular. Combat became a chess match played at lethal speed. German commanders increased infantry screens, aggressively sending grenadiers ahead to flush out ambushes with grenades and small arms. Bazooka teams became priority targets, and casualty rates among gunners remained high because tanks still drew fire even when disabled. A dead tank could still kill men through supporting weapons. Yet, despite losses, the balance had shifted. Infantry no longer waited passively. They maneuvered, coordinated, and hunted. February 1945, intelligence summaries credited infantry anti-tank fire with a significant share of armored losses. On the Western Front, not because it replaced artillery or air power, but because it filled gaps when those assets were absent. The psychological effect outweighed raw numbers. German crews approached villages, forests, and road junctions. Assuming danger at every corner, advances slowed, fuel consumption increased, recovery operations multiplied, and damaged tanks were abandoned rather than risk repair. Under fire, American infantry officers noticed something subtle. Men stood their ground. Longer positions were held more. Often withdrawals were deliberate rather than panicked. Training manuals were rewritten in pencil and blood. Experience spread laterally through units. Veterans demonstrated shot placement using chalk on captured hulls, discussing angles, ranges, and mistakes with brutal honesty. The weapon never became easy, it became respected. Stories circulated of shots that failed, of teams wiped out after successful kills, reminders that technology was a tool, not a guarantee. Yet, the fundamental change endured. Infantry had agency. Again, this phase of the story is not triumphant. It is sobering. It shows that even effective technology demands understanding, discipline, and humility. Shaped charge rockets saved lives, but only when used with patience, intelligence, and coordination, and even then, war extracted payment in blood. The weapon narrowed the gap between man and machine, but never erased it. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe entered its final violent acceleration, and the infantry anti-tank weapon, once treated as emergency equipment, became integrated doctrine, shaping how ground forces advanced across shattered landscapes. The bazooka was no longer carried only by designated gunners, but understood by entire squads. Because survival depended on collective awareness, men learned to read terrain not as open or closed ground, but as lines of approach and denial. Hedgerows, rubble piles, burned out vehicles, shell craters, and collapsed barns all became firing positions, rehearsed mentally before contact. Commanders issued standing orders that no road, junction, bridge, or village edge would be entered without ANTI armor coverage. Tanks moved, but they no longer led blindly. Instead, infantry scouted forward, probing with eyes and ears, while bazooka teams shadowed flanks, prepared for sudden encounters. German armor still fought hard, but numbers dwindled. Fuel shortages immobilized vehicles before battle began. Crews cannibalized tanks for parts, leaving hulks that littered the countryside and served as landmarks of attrition. Psychological strain mounted among defenders, because every silhouette, every hedgerow gap, every ruined doorway could conceal a rocket tube. The sound of firing had become familiar enough that even civilians recognized it. A hollow roar followed by the violent slap of impact, yet uncertainty remained because sometimes the rocket struck true and sometimes it did not. Misfires occurred, rushed shots went wide. Nerves betrayed steady hands. Training emphasized breathing, discipline, and communication. Calling ranges, estimating angles under stress. These skills separated survival from annihilation. American units advancing into Germany encountered urban combat on an unprecedented scale. Towns were reduced to skeletal frameworks. Streets choked with debris, basements turned into firing nests. Bazooka teams operated from cellars, stairwells, and upper floors, firing downward onto thinner top armor. Despite warnings about backblast, confined spaces forced risk calculations. Men fired anyway because hesitation meant death. Coordination with riflemen was essential. Suppressing enemy infantry to give gunners seconds to aim. German tactics shifted toward ambushes, using Panzerfausts mirroring the same logic that now empowered Allied infantry, creating deadly symmetry where both sides hunted armor and men with similar weapons. Casualty rates spiked in close quarters, and many engagements ended in silence, broken only by crackling fires and collapsing masonry. As resistance collapsed, formal surrenders increased. But danger did not end immediately, because isolated defenders continued to fight from habit, fear, or indoctrination. Bazooka teams were ordered to remain alert even during ceasefire negotiations, because a single rogue shot could restart chaos after the Rhine crossing. Logistical superiority flooded the front with replacements, ammunition, and fuel, while German units thinned and fragmented, yet the weapon retained relevance, because even a lone tank could block an advance or devastate infantry columns. The bazooka became a reassurance, more than a guarantee, a presence that steadied nerves and enabled movement. Veterans later described a shift in posture. Men walked taller, not because they were fearless, but because they were no longer helpless. After the fall of major cities, reports documented fewer tank-led breakthroughs and more cautious armored movement, confirming that infantry-based anti-tank threat had reshaped battlefield behavior in these final months. The weapon symbolized adaptation rather than dominance. It showed how learning under fire could compress years of doctrinal evolution into months paid for with blood. When victory finally came, many bazookas lay discarded beside roads, not as relics of glory, but as tools that had served their grim purpose. The men who carried them remembered weight, cold, recoil, and fear not. Heroism. This phase closes the arc not with triumph, but with exhaustion, because wars do not end with clarity. They end with silence and survival. When the guns finally fell silent and the formal end of the war in Europe was announced, the infantryman who had carried the bazooka did not celebrate immediately, because survival had taught them caution. Even in peace, columns halted slowly, weapons remained close, hands stayed near triggers, and eyes searched ruins out of habit. Surrendering troops were disarmed. Methodically, armor stood idle, engines, cold crews stepping out with hollow expressions. The bazooka now rested against walls and trees, its role complete, yet its presence still influenced behavior, because men trusted what had kept them alive. The landscape bore scars of its use. Tanks Burned out along roads, village corners, punched open walls, collapsed where rockets had struck. These were not symbols of glory, but evidence of necessity. In after-action reports, officers noted that the weapon had reshaped infantry. Confidence altered enemy tactics, and compressed years of tactical evolution into a brutal season of learning. Veterans remembered moments more than statistics: the smell of propellant, the shockwave against the chest, the fear of misfire, the split second between firing and impact, where fate was decided. Some recalled missed shots that haunted them, others remembered successful hits followed by silence, where moments earlier death had advanced on steel tracks. The weapon did not make heroes, it made survivors, and survival became the quiet measure of success in post-war. Training manuals, the lessons were formalized. Diagrams replaced memory, yet those pages were written by men who had learned under fire. The bazooka would evolve into new systems. Lighter, stronger, more precise. But its first true legacy was psychological. It taught infantry that adaptation could challenge even the most terrifying machines, that human ingenuity, when paired with discipline, could shift the balance without erasing cost. Decades later, museums displayed the weapon behind glass, stripped of danger and noise. But veterans who passed by saw something else. They saw frozen moments of fear and resolve. They remembered comrades who carried tubes and rockets and never returned, and those who did return carried weight that no display could show. This final phase of the story closes not on the battlefield but in memory, where the weapon becomes a symbol of wartime learning rather than victory. And if this story helped you see the war not as spectacle but as experience, then stay with this channel. Subscribe now, because more untold chapters of history are waiting to be uncovered.